There's that sense of his control over who does this work. And so to take that across space to Britain is a sort of profound loss of his authority in certain respects. When Caro argues that the Quran is the Quran, that there is no difference between it being spoken live or broadcast over the radio, he's focusing in on those elements of the communicative event that stress extension of the Quran, not transformation, that emphasize continuity, not difference. In this, Caro is not speaking just for himself, but for the whole class of young modernizing Muslims, that class moving into the colonial civil service. And they are using Caro because the traditional hierarchies mean they can't make this argument. They have to go through the British resident. So Emir Abdullahi looks at this same communicative event and he stresses elements of incommensuration and difference. Radio reorganizes sound, divorcing it from its existing spatial and ritual context, and extends it over urban space more broadly. As Walter Honors argued, unlike images which can be turned away from or ignored, the materiality of sound creates a reciprocating sense. It's contagious in that sense. It's hard to turn away from in the same way. In a given instant, I hear not merely what is in front of me or behind me, or at either side, but all things simultaneously. As Emir Abdullahi argued, the loudspeakers were in public places and the sound could now travel to places it could previously not reach. The prayers Abdullahi objected to were used to open and close radio broadcasts, so they were tied to the secular homogeneous public time of the radio set, rather than the vertical religious time of Islam. As Hirschkin notes, to listen to the Quran is not a matter of hearing, but involves this bodily training. When sound is broadcast in new arenas, the ability to communally and individually organize this proper sensory practice is dramatically affected. Some of the boxes are in public places and open courtyards. The words in the Holy Quran might be coming out of loudspeakers, and most irregular things might be going on. It's true, once you take it and start, in the logic of the radio medium, discharging the sound onto urban space, you cannot control the proper conditions of listening. And it creates, as you can see, an anxiety. The words may be the same, but the movement into a different medium, the transmission to new physical spaces, means a recitation of the Quran. For Emir Abdullahi is something dramatically different. The resident and the Emir confront the same circulatory media practice, but view it quite differently. For the resident, the act of circulation is a difference that doesn't make a difference. For the Emir, the same movement crosses a line from legality to illegality within Islamic law. To engage in this argument, and this is what I'm interested in, both of them have to generate media theories. They both have to understand what the medium is or generate an argument for it to define what that thing is in order for this argument to be conducted. This is the sort of ground on which the argument can be conducted. So the anxieties here is how do we understand media and develop this media theory. The rise of new technologies impose new disciplines upon people, new modes of listening, new technological capacities that act upon people to shape their experience of space and time and reference, as does Islam. So they're both carrying with them their own traditions, and this is what's at stake in this confrontation. To understand media necessitates understanding Islam, and vice versa. So, I'm going to show some conclusions. Two other examples. So the article on the radio, or this debate around the radio, is about how we need to take media theory seriously. About how we need to move beyond techniques to understand the structuring a priori of media. The banning of the Quran at this point, and then what I don't go into here, but there are various factors that will later come on to legitimate why you can use the Quran, are an example of this exchange over media and religion. It's an example of how people have to develop their own theories of media. But what's interesting for me, and I can't really get into it here, is it also sort of reverses some of the understanding we have about this distinction between the non-modern and the modern. Because partly to develop a media theory in the context of Islam means not just how do we understand the media, what it means precisely is how do we understand Islamic law in relationship to the media. And at this point, as media were moving, so was Islamic law. So when I began to interview clerics about what was going on in these sorts of extensions, as one person said to me, because we were ignorant then. Why is it that people used to think that, the radio might be ghosts coming and speaking? Well, why do people say that you should never listen to the radio? And this one cleric, Cyril Brown, said, because we were ignorant. And when he talks about being ignorant, he's not talking about not understanding the technology. He's talking about not understanding Islamic law. Because he continues. Because now we've gone to the Middle East, we've traveled to Saudi Arabia, we understand these things. We understand what Islamic law is. And he didn't say that, he just said, now we've travelled so much, he gives this whole thing about travelling. And in a sense, what he's talking about is the fact that we now generated a theory within Islamic law in order to understand media. And so what you get in the encounter of all these things is this mixture of the materiality of religious tradition, the understanding of Islamic law, and the history of media theory, which all get pulled together. Thank you very much. Can we take questions?
Yes, take questions.
Anyone got a question?
Thanks, that was a great talk. Something I find interesting, it still goes on in the education arena in this country, is at that time in Nigeria, certain people who were tied in more to the formal education system were afraid that radio diffusion would lead to a bypass of print literacy. But their commitment in the school system was to develop print literacy, whereas people in the administrative structure weren't particularly interested in the competition between two kinds of media, print literacy and radio diffusion. They just wanted to demonstrate the power of technology and communicate their message as widely as they could. And it was interesting that a lot of people in education felt, I'm called the secondary orality, where you go straight from traditional oral culture into radio diffusion, etc., and just totally not worried about print literacy. But there was an argument that went on in Nigeria at that time, and it kind of took place between people in the formal education system felt their power was undercut a bit by radio diffusion. This argument goes on still in education when people feel that the power of the public school or the formal education system is undercut by media in various kinds of ways.
Do you know much about Nigeria in this period? Or about this? We should talk about it.
Yeah.
Because I'm sort of fascinated by that. I mean, I think the work on literacy is fantastic for a number of reasons. But in terms of the other anxiety would be in traditional Islamic education, and still really at this point in the 40s, which would still be a dominant form, people would master texts. So religious learning was a sort of peripatetic tradition where certain clerics would wander, but more often disciples would wander. So if you wanted to learn the Quran properly, you would go to Maison, and you would live over there, and you would reside in Borno with those clerics who knew that word. If you wanted to know fiqh, you would go to Khan. If you wanted to know something else, you would go somewhere else. So you would go to sit with clerics, and so and this tradition still exists in the context of Sufism, where people still have that tradition where clerics will sit and people sit on the floor with their heads pressed practically to the ground and not look at their cleric as they listen to him. Those modes of communication are still there. So you have the Islamic tradition of that marrying of text with body, and that transmission of knowledge in the context of the disciple-murid relationship, which is powerful for Sufism in particular. You have the secular one with the rise of print, and now you have the rise of radio. I'm not sure, I didn't come across that debate, and I would be fascinated. And what I'm interested in that is partly because I've been more and more interested in the way that sort of McLuhan and others rest on this sort of intensity of these sorts of divides. The divide between the poorer self and the buffet self. And one of the things that the work of literacy did in sort of arguing against Walter On and arguing against McLuhan is just that, look, there's an entire panoply of literacies that can range from writing your name to sort of reading higher. Now, we tend to think of literacy is when you can generally read, but even after you can read, there are enormous variances in what literacy means in terms of understanding a talk like I've just given or something else. And so what it does is it helps us to see, because the print hasn't gone away. We still have that argument today. Learning by traditional sort of Muqaddimah relation hasn't gone away. There's oftentimes a presumption of this sort of stage of theory that the age of something replaces the age of something else. There certainly is an overcoding. There certainly is a reorientation of the relation between all these media, as McLuhan would say, but they don't actually go away. And what you find out is there's a recursiveness, and that people make use of these registers that are available to them. So the same people who sit at the foot of the Muqaddam will also be going to school, will also be listening to cassettes on sermons, will also be, etc., etc. There's now this sort of ecology of different options that we've been trained to teach of in terms of this, sort of discursive shift from one to the other. But in fact, they all get mixed all the time. So the Catholic Church adapted to Protestantism, but still maintained many of its traditional practices. Just as Sufism, like for me in the literature of northern Nigeria, there's a very common narrative that it was Sufi, then along came